Hey Josh, thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to dive into your talk, HR 101. I think this is an extremely valuable talk. And to put it in perspective, last week we actually had a panel conversation titled Witches and Alewives. It was a popular article in the news recently from the Smithsonian. They had shared it, about women being forced out of the craft beer industry
Mhm.
during medieval times. We dove into a lot of issues discussing whether or not the claims made in the article were true, as in if they
Mhm.
were really getting pushed from the industry because of being witches. But really, issues that we're dealing with back then in medieval times are still relevant today. There's really unfortunate things going on in the craft beer world with regard to treatment of different people in the industry. And I think, while we had a conversation last week about things that took place hundreds of years ago, they're still very relevant today and people are being mistreated in our industry. But before we dive into that, if you could just tell everybody who you are and why you're here today.
Hey everyone, my name is Josh Lance. I am the CEO of Table HR. We're a HR consulting company focused on working with food and beverage companies across the U.S. and kind of helping them build better businesses with better HR practices.
Well, Josh, as always, thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
It's fun to have you wearing your Table HR hat because normally you provide us so much financial
Yeah.
insight, whether on a panel or presentation. So it's nice to turn the tables on you. Now, I have to ask you a question. Why did you first decide to get into HR in addition to, brewery finances and accounting?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that just came from our experiences working with breweries, that some of these questions started to crop up. And as we were working deeper with our clients, kind of saw the need of it, right? So, in working on the Lance CPA group side of things, we get a lot of questions from our clients on hiring and firing practices, and especially during the pandemic, how do we furlough, layoff? What does that mean? How does this all work with unemployment? And some of the stuff starts to kind of dovetail and intersect with each other. And so, we really started to see this need of, with breweries in particular, and especially, breweries and restaurants, the whole food and beverage industry at large, that a lot of them just don't have, either great HR practices or even the foundation, even work off there. And so we were starting to see that need. We started to see the need, especially as you started to see some Me Too allegations or sexual harassment allegations in the industry of. And it really started to point back to, okay, there weren't good HR practices. The person running HR was also the owner of the company, and no one felt comfortable going to that person. And really kind of feeling the need of, like, there needs to be kind of an independent HR function for these businesses, so the employees feel cared, they feel safe, and have the ability to discuss issues they may have, or feel like there is actually an HR function that supports them.
It's been unfortunate in the news lately. We've read a lot about the Boulevard leaders knowing of sexual harassment but didn't stop it. While that has been a recent news story from February, the craft beer industry, while we are young, I believe we are in a position where we should have had HR practices in place prior to this. It shouldn't take an unfortunate incident like this where there's victims and people having to go through such poor treatment. Why is it now that we're seeing more talk about HR, and why do you believe breweries haven't traditionally had, an HR department or someone specifically handling HR, issues?
Yeah, I think on that last question, I think part of the reason was, for a lot of small businesses, owners wear many hats, right? So they're just trying to get the business off the ground. They are acting as the HR person, as the brewer, as the accountant, as the salesperson, as the taproom manager, right? And some of that just out of necessity. You don't have the resources. You're just trying to get the thing off the ground. But then there's that kind of shift to being the startup business to being kind of an established business, and you start to need to have these established practices. And I think that's where, some breweries just haven't gotten to that point, or haven't seen the need of that until issues arise, right? And I think we're seeing a lot more of these issues just come about because I think they've existed this entire time. It's just now people are coming forward and feel comfortable coming forward because, there's kind of snowball effect of, you start hearing a couple of people bring this issue up front, then other people feel comfortable bring their own issues. And we're starting to actually uncover, kind of pull back the rocks and uncover all the issues that, that exist there, that have existed for a while, right? So, I think especially in the brewing industry, this is, this has been an issue, and now we're starting just to see that become more public, and really again highlights the need of actually having an HR function within your business that supports your employees, and putting the investment and effort behind that, I think really shows your employees that you do care for them and you do want what's best for them, and you want to put the foundational things to support them as they work for you.
And Josh, at what point in time should a brewery consider implementing, basic HR practices, or consider hiring someone to help with that?
Yeah, I think you need that stuff when you start your business, right? And I think for a lot of breweries, what they may have done is, maybe talk to someone else. How do you hire people in? They may have Google things, things like that. When it comes to like an employee handbook, for instance, right? Like that's kind of a foundational element that every business should have, regardless if you're a brewery or an ice cream shop or whatever that may be, right? And a lot of them don't, or they found one online. It's like, okay, this is a handbook. We have this now, and didn't really give two thoughts about it. And I think that's where it really needs to start is, even if you're not going to hire, someone like Table HR or some other HR professional help you out, at least start and get in crafting a good employee handbook that is relevant to your business, relevant to the state that you're in, because there's different rules and regulations in every state out there, and you need to have those policies in your handbook. Have that handbook be dynamic to what's going on with your employees, how they know how to interact with issues they may have, how to bring forth things to ownership or to some other independent professional, how you deal with benefits, things like that, right? So I think that's something that needs to happen at the beginning. And if you haven't done that, I think at that point, you really need to start, like hiring an HR professional, get some of that foundational elements at least in place. Because those are things that are really important to making sure you're starting off on the right foot with your employees.
So let's dive into this employee handbook for a minute. So many breweries, when they first launch, to brewery owners or come from different industries. Their professions aren't necessarily in brewing prior or HR prior, so they might not know what a employee handbook is. What are some of the basics? I know you touched on them briefly, but what are some of the basic bullet points that we should make sure we have in an employee handbook? And is there a good place brewery owners can reference to look at a guide?
Yeah, so I think there are some of the basic elements you want to have in there is the kind of discussion of your company, what's going on, basic policies and procedures. So some of that's mandated by whatever state you're in, has certain things that must be in your employee handbook. Some of those things are just the policies and procedures you have, in your company. So if someone needs to take a sick day or call in sick, what do they do, right? You put that in your employee handbook. So it's very clear and easy to see, for your employee what they need to do. I think, some other things are going to be benefit related things, right? And even if you say, well, we don't offer benefits, you offer some benefits tangentially. And so discuss what those are. Maybe it's sick time. Maybe it's, your workers' comp looks like, basic things like that. Discuss issues of, dealing with sexual harassment or issues of where maybe there is some sort of HR issue or management related issue, and how employees can then deal with that issue, right? Where do they go to? How do they communicate that? What's the kind of proper lines of communication for all that stuff? Talk about things like vacation time and holidays and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that happen in there. What you don't want your employee handbook to be is just some static document that no one ever references ever again, right? You give it to an employee on the first day, they thumb through it, they toss it aside, and no one thinks about that ever again, right? Because then that's not really helpful to anyone. It needs to be dynamic, needs to be constantly updated and refreshed. It needs to be brought to your employees' attention on a regular basis. So when you have staff meetings, refer back to the employee handbook, point some things out in there, let people know that it exists, where they can find it if they don't have a copy of it, and make that a dynamic, living, breathing document that you constantly refer back to. Because I think if you do that and place some emphasis on there, the employees will see and understand what's going on. They understand what the employer is offering. They understand how to deal with issues. And that's a really great place to start there.
Do you have any suggestions for encouraging employees to want to dive into the employee handbook? Because the term handbook, can be a little overwhelming sometimes. It feels like more of a corporate practice, and so many people in the craft beer world, they don't want to feel like they have to read a manual of how to operate. But everything we talk about is obviously extremely important. But what are some suggestions to make the practices in the handbook more accessible and, I don't know if fun's the right word, but something more approachable?
Yeah, I think one of the ways is just how you write it. You don't have to write in this legalese, boring, thing, right? You can actually make it really cool and fun, and some of your employees will want to read. I've even seen companies will put in place a small bonus that, hey, if you read the employee handbook and answer a short quiz and pass it, we'll give you a bonus of $50, whatever that is, right? Just to put some money on the table, say, hey, this is actually important. I want you to look at it, and if you go through and do that, I'll give you a little bonus for completing that goal. I think other ways to do it again is to really highlight the things that are important for your employees, right? There's some things in there that have to be required and are legalese in nature because the state that you're in requires that in your handbook, right? But there are things that are important that they should refer to that are key, and I would highlight those in a way in the handbook, and then bring that up again. Highlight that in your staff meeting and say, like, hey, we're going to go over how we deal with sick time this week, or how we how you deal with a complaint or things like that. So you're constantly referring back to that so they know, okay, this exists. This actually has a lot of good information for me in case I have an issue in the workplace, in case it's a workers' comp thing, in case it's I just want to know who I can contact to talk about benefits, right? That's a really kind of a great place to have it. I would digitize it as well. If you have a company Slack channel or whatever, drop it in there, have a place where it exists so it's easy for them to get and search and find.
Now, we talk about this employee handbook. Do you recommend any sort of document to be posted on a wall behind the bar or in a place that breweries are actively spending time? It's like a top 10 list of, hey, remember these important aspects of working here. Is there any recommendations with regard to that?
Yeah, I would put either a top 10 list or kind of key points, from the handbook and where to reference it. Put that in the break room, put it somewhere where, again, employees can see it. The goal is not to have your employee handbook something that you hide away from your employees, but that is very accessible to them. And the more ways you kind of highlight that and show that it exists, it's better for the employees. They know it exists. They know where they can find answers to some of their questions. And it's not this thing where it's like, okay, I remember getting on my first day of work and I don't remember what it is anymore. And I have questions. I don't know where to go now. You want that to be something very accessible and that it is in their face in kind of a nice way, where they know to find it or know what's in there.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, one of my favorite things about craft beer professionals, especially during the pandemic, it helps remind all of us that we're not alone. So many of the same challenges other people are facing halfway across the country. And I believe a lot of brewery owners and taproom managers, aren't always sure where to start with HR practices. And based off your experiences, what percentage of breweries that you interact with typically have, HR practices in place prior to you starting to work with them?
Very little. Again, it's usually things they find online. It's things that's, I remember doing this at my job when I worked at a restaurant before, so I'm going to incorporate some of that stuff. A lot of it is very focused on when people initially start, but it doesn't focus on how people work and interact with the company, throughout their tenure there. And so that's where you start to have to kind of build out some of those things of what does this mean beyond just your first day. And there's a lot of things that are good around on building good onboarding procedures and how you bring employees in, but it's how do you continue to interact with your employees and ultimately be in a place where you are retaining them and it's you're lessening turnover and things like that. So putting in good HR practices is I think really key to that. And it's really just kind of, again, starting at those foundational elements of, okay, let's think about benefits in our company. Maybe we don't have money to offer benefits. We're not required to offer health insurance, things like that. But what are things we can offer to our employees? Maybe it's mental health things. Maybe we partner with a mental health agency like Hope for the Day or something like that, where there's resources available to them for that. Or maybe it's simple things like we give people their day off on their birthday, paid time off, right? Just little things that you can start to do that really start to get that employee engagement up, really reinforce your culture in your company of what you're trying to build, and do those things where, again, it's front of mind and front and center to your employees, which really kind of again shows that you really care about the well-being of your employees. And that's a really kind of good outcome of a good HR practice is doing those things that allow your employees to feel like they're cared for, like they are important, and that we want to make sure what's best for you, and not just okay, well, you're here to do work for us, and that's all we care about.
What are some of the more unique and successful examples of breweries, kind of letting their employees know that they care?
Yeah, I think it really comes to company culture and what you want your company culture to be. We've seen, I think the mental health benefit, I think is a big one. I think that's one where it's not a lot of effort from the business itself, but it is something that can be really impactful to employees, and doing things around that. I also see things like, companies, will, talk to employees about, hey, what's a nonprofit that we can support, right? Maybe we'll do a night where 10% of the sales go to this nonprofit or whatever that may be, right? And have the employees kind of pick that, come together and say, hey, we want to support this organization, right? That's a really great way to elevate some of the cares of your employees that they have in a way that the businesses have participated in. And so those are great ways to do it. Doing fun things, right? It doesn't have to be all business here, right? So we've seen things like companies do kind of photo scavenger hunts with their teams, where it's like, hey, find these 10 things in where you live, or wherever you can find them, and post pictures of them and how you interact with them, and just have fun with those things, right? And so doing those little things, where it's not something that costs you money, right? But these little kind of things where you're really engaging your employees, you're trying to build the culture that you want in your company, I think are really fruitful. And some of your employees do care about, right? Like you kind of take the time and effort to put some focus on those items, shows that, hey, I care about you. I care about, the company that we're in here, that you're part of this team, and we want to ensure that, that you're here for a good while, and that we're taking care of you as a result.
And we're talking a lot about company culture today. Company culture obviously starts at the top, because if you want to build a place people enjoy working, it starts with the leaders and goes down to all staff, because that vibe and that energy is going to radiate to your guests. So it's extremely important to have that positive company culture. And you mentioned a few team building activities recently. Obviously, we're all in the craft beer industry. We all would love drinking, but how important is it to have not necessarily non-drinking, but outside activities outside the brew house to kind of encourage that team building and people to want to work together?
Yeah, I think those are great. I think those are things that, again, really build the cohesiveness of your team, and especially if you're at a small brewery where you may only have 4 or 5 other employees there, right? Like doing those things to really show that, hey, we're all in this together, that we want to that we care about the culture we have in this company, and so we'll do those kind of fun things outside of work. I think it's important for those teams to feel kind of sticky to the company, and they show that kind of appreciation, and as a result they stay around, or they're invested in the company itself and seeing its success, right? And so you start to see some of those kind of interplays where you focus on these team building or culture things, and then that manifests itself in employees, not just coming to work and just doing the job and leaving, but like caring about the success of the business and doing things that allow that success, right? So one of the things that that you see in breweries sometimes is that there's a lot of waste, especially in the tap room, right? And if you have a kind of culture where employees just don't care, and they're here and they're going to clock in, clock out, right? Like you're going to have more of those waste items, and that comes at a cost, right? And so, but if we start to build in this culture and build in like, hey, like we really care about you and you're important to us, and we want to hear your ideas about how we can be better as a company, those employees now have much more buy-in to the company, and as a result, they start to see things that you don't see it, right, on a daily basis. So maybe they see some of the waste items. They see like, hey, like we're actually, we're pouring a lot of wasted beer here, or I noticed that some of our bartenders are, giving away a lot of free beer, and that's lost revenue, and we need to think about how we are doing better about that, or we're just wasting a lot of supplies, or we're not being, really paying attention to what's going on around us, and those things can start to crop up that where now your employees are invested in the company, and as a result, they're finding ways to save you money or run the business better, and that's what you want, right? That your employees have that investment in your company.
No, it's fantastic that by focusing on HR practices, you can actually save money and become more efficient. So that's great. Now, looking at breweries that you've interacted with, what are some common mistakes besides not having like an HR policy or handbook in place that you see breweries making in the current state of the world?
Yeah, I think one of the big mistakes that we see, or one of the big issues that we see, is that that HR function is at the employee at the ownership level, right? So when there are complaints or issues by the employees, they may not feel comfortable going to the owners with that, especially if it's the owners that's the issue, and so that creates this situation where issues are arising, but they're not being uncovered, and they're not being addressed, right? And that can create a lot of issues. We've seen that as some of these issues have arisen in the industry, where that was a big source of the problem, was that the HR person was also one of the owners of the company, and no one felt comfortable going to them, or they saw that owner not treat employees well, and it's like, well, if I come to them, then I'm going to, face blowback, or they're not going to take me seriously, or whatever that may be, right? And so, that's usually a big issue we see. Another big issue we see is that, if, especially if you have, layers of managers in place, right? And maybe some of those managers aren't treating employees well, or, doing things that are unethical, or things in that nature, right? And ownership's not addressing that, or letting that stuff happen, right? Which is, again, that's kind of the boulevard issue there, right? There's these issues that were plain as day, but then ownership never addressed it and allowed that to happen. We see that issue arise as well, right? So, if you do have managers in place, or kind of hierarchical leadership, that it's important that there is accountability in place, and that accountability is enforced. So if there are issues that arise, or if there is a manager that it's treating an employee poorly, and the employee goes to the HR function to the owner to state that action is taken, and that person feels like comfortable that the employee or the company will take action in that situation, and they don't face the blowback from the manager, right? So we see that issue arise there as well. I think there's also just little issues about how the company deals with things like benefits, or just like how the company takes care of their employees, and if there's just lack of clarity, or things are being provided but then or stated that they're being provided but then aren't followed through on, I think is an issue, right? And they can be little tiny things where it's like, hey, like we are going to give money to non-for-profit, but then the company never follows through with that, or those things are kind of really impactful to employees, because this creates a breach of trust of like, hey, you said you're going to do something, you didn't do it, and now like I don't feel comfortable here, or I don't feel like I can take you for your word, and that may seem minor, from the ownership perspective, that can be really impactful for employees, and so paying attention to those things, I think, is really important as well.
Now, one thing you mentioned, that there's so many breweries where the owner also is the quote unquote HR person. Yeah. Let's just pretend for a minute. Let's role play. Let's say I'm the brewery owner, and I do something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. There's probably a lot of people who are also in the same situation where they don't know how to handle that situation. What advice can you give to someone working at a brewery where the owner is the HR person? How should they handle that, or what should they do if they have something uncomfortable happen to them?
Yeah, so I think in that situation, you still need to voice your complaint. So you need to go to someone else who is in leadership to voice that, right? So if that person wearing the HR hat is the cause of the issue, that becomes an issue where you need to either take it to their owner or take it to some other manager and say, hey, here's this problem. How do we address this? And how do we work together to make sure we can solve this? Because I don't feel comfortable going to the owner because maybe they're the one perpetrating it, or maybe they're seeing it happen and not do anything about it. And so I think that's a situation where you want to get other leadership involved. But I think that's also a situation where you want to have an independent HR professional with you, right? Because that's someone that person can go to and say, I have an issue. I need this to be addressed, and I want to make sure it gets taken care of. And by bringing in the HR professional into that, that helps really kind of ensure that happens, and that and that the kind of policies and procedures when issues arise are followed through on. And I think unfortunately there is lots of circumstances where when the owner is wearing that HR hat and that owner is perpetrating that issue. And again, that's where you want to have that independent HR professional there. And if not, you need to go to someone else in leadership and say, like, hey, I have this issue. I know I'm supposed to go to so-and-so because they're the HR person, but I can't feel comfortable doing that because they're the one causing the issue.
So in situations like that, where you mentioned an outside HR department, when should a brewery consider reaching out to someone like yourself to kind of help them get things in order? Obviously, this is something they should have from the beginning, but if they don't have it in place already, should they reach out now? Should they try to do things on their own? Or, if the situation like we just talked about happened where I did something that made you feel uncomfortable, should the employees suggest it to the owner?
Yeah, I think, once you start having and hiring employees and having a good workforce in place, that's really when you need to have that HR professional in place that is not the owner. Because there are going to be issues that arise. There are going to be issues that even maybe you as the owner who isn't an HR professional don't feel comfortable even maybe dealing with or know how to deal with, right? So it may not even be you perpetrating the issue. Maybe I just don't know how to deal with that situation, or what's the right way to deal with it, or what's my legal considerations I have to take in place when dealing with this particular situation, right? So you don't want to leave that stuff up to guesswork, because that can lead to Department of Labor complaints, that can lead to potential lawsuits, right? So this really almost acts as a risk management tool as well, of like, okay, I have a workforce now, I have people that I am employing and taking care of. I need to have someone in place to ensure that people feel comfortable with issues or questions or complaints, but also that we're doing the right things in place. And I'm not getting myself into a situation where I'm creating a Department of Labor issue or open myself up to maybe legal risk as well. So, I know a lot of small breweries start up and it's just the owners working there, maybe some family members. And at that point, you're probably okay where you're at. But when you start really hiring people in there, and given the level of regulation that surrounds a brewery, you really want to start to have an HR professional or position, or someone that you have be able to come in and provide that level of service that really kind of saves you from that legal risk, as well as provides a better experience for your employees.
No, good advice there, Josh. Now let's look at like larger breweries. I mean, Boulevard, for example, a very large brewery, and they had quite a few allegations come out. But what advice do you have when there's that first person who feels uncomfortable, but they don't want to be the only one to feel this way because they feel like they might have done something wrong, which is absolutely not the case. But what advice can you give to someone at a larger brewery who feels they've experienced something unfortunate in the path to take, without feeling like it's a challenging situation for them?
Yeah. It's a really hard situation for that person, because you don't know what to do or where to go to, right? Like you have the question, was that something I did? What should I actually do in this situation? What happens if I do bring this up? What's going to happen to me, right? And so I think for that person, you want to encourage that person to actually bring that forward, right? Because the likelihood is, especially in situations like Boulevard or other bigger companies, you have other people experiencing that same situation. So it's not like it's never an isolated incident. It is something that is either systemic in the company or other people are experiencing it. And so it is important to bring that up. Now, sometimes it may be, let's bring it up to my immediate supervisor first. And let's say, okay, I'm having this issue. I don't know where to go. can you help me through this, right? And if you do have that HR person on staff, right, then also going to that person and saying, okay, like I have this issue, how do I deal with it? And sometimes you'll have in companies that are a little bit bigger and have a HR department, they may even have a way to provide complaints anonymously. So you don't even have to put your name to it right off the bat, but say, okay, there's this issue, this person's perpetuating, and I felt that like it needs to be looked into, right? So, it's a really, really hard situation for, people in that position to deal with. That's a great example of having someone who's an independent HR person or having someone on staff that can take that and actually has the authority to do something about it. And it's not in, again, I think with the Boulevard situation, you had HR people involved, but they're actually, kind of more siding with the owners or letting it slide and not being helpful there, right? And really kind of, not using their role well and actually kind of shirking their duties there, right? So, you do want to have, when you do have an HR professional in place or an independent HR professional that you hire, to make sure they have authority and to deal with that with ownership and allow them to bring that up and not be someone who is now like beholden to ownership, where now that person doesn't feel comfortable going there because it feels like that HR person is just another tool of ownership or management that may not be helpful to me.
When considering an outside HR person, is this a company that's essentially you're interacting with virtually, or is this person someone who's going to come actually, host staff meetings, have interactions, be face-to-face? What's the typical role of an outsourced HR company?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a little bit of both. It can be virtual, and sometimes it's easier to do it virtually, and sometimes even employees feel more comfortable in that setting because they're not waiting for that HR person to come on site or things like that. They can go to that person directly and kind of voice their issues or complaints or things they're dealing with. I think it's important that if you do have an HR professional that you hire, that person is introduced to your team, that it's, again, regularly brought up, not something just, okay, we put in place, check the box, we got it, and we move on from there. But that is, again, brought up in staff meetings. There's information in the break room or somewhere where they have that contact information of that person in case they have questions, issues arise, things like that. Again, that could be somewhere that person comes on site and maybe comes to a team meeting and leads a session with them or does it virtually as well. And so I think either way works. But again, it's important that if a company or brewery hires an HR professional, that not only do you let your employees know about it, but you continually let your employees know about it, so they are aware of it. And as new employees come in, they know, okay, hey, we have this person we can go to if we have questions about the employee handbook or questions about benefits or questions about dealing with a complaint with a supervisor. And so having that again front and center and letting employees know that this exists is important. And again, that's a great way for you as a company to care for your employees, right? That you're making this investment, say, hey, like we need to have this function in here, and we need to have this function that is independent of us as leadership in the company. So having that in place really, is again a good way to show that your employees say, hey, we care for you. This person's there for you. The primary purpose of this HR person is not for the ownership, it is for the employees. And so they're there to help you to deal with issues, to help on board, to help, even small questions, big questions, anything that's related to that HR function, they're there for you for that. And by doing that, again, can help help your employee culture, help to just ensure that hey, the company does care for you, and we want to make sure we have the resources in place to care for you.
No, that's great feedback right there. And I'm lucky enough to talk to so many great brewery owners and taproom managers daily. And one thing that I've helped create is what I refer to as an employee happiness survey. It's something I essentially encourage them to send to their staff once a month, just kind of keep a pulse on, how pleased the staff is with, the daily interactions.
Yeah.
Do they enjoy interacting with the brewer? Do they enjoy interacting with the taproom manager? How about the owners? How happy are they with their position? What they love, what they don't like, what would motivate them to do more? For something like that, I know you love metrics. You love key performance metrics. What are some of the metrics or suggestions you would give for a brewery looking to do something similar, or just a way to survey their staff? and what should they monitor?
Yeah, I love the idea of doing the employee surveys and doing those monthly. I think it's a great way to get feedback, especially if it's a way where you as the owner are just seeing the anonymous results of that.
Yeah, I should add they are anonymous.
Yeah. And so I think that's really important. And in addition to asking those happiness questions, I would also add in questions that may be specific to some of the company that you change up each month, right? So maybe this next month we talk about benefits, or the month after that we talk about company culture, or month after that we talk about how, would you recommend us to a friend you may have who's looking for a job, right? Or things like that, right? And then by doing that and seeing those results and kind of monitoring those results month by month, you kind of see how things are trending, right? And sometimes that's a great way to start pick up on maybe some uneasiness in with your staff, or people are maybe looking to change jobs or what it may be, because you start to see these results that may come back, more negative, or some feedback you get from this survey that kind of starts to highlight some issues, right? So I think it's a great tool to have in there. There are a lot of great ways to go about doing this. You can do it simply through just a regular type form survey or Google form survey. Depending on your payroll provider, they may even have that ability to do that within your HR software. And so by doing that and kind of seeing those results and kind of saying, okay, well, what are we seeing from this? Allows you as the company to kind of make some better decisions, or see like, hey, we have a gap here, or maybe we have a gap in training, for instance, right? And we're getting some negative feedback on training, or we're getting some negative feedback on, people don't feel comfortable maybe, saying, hey, tell my friend to come work here, right? And so that gives us areas to work on. And that's also a great way, to bring that to the attention of your HR professional and say like, hey, we got these results. There's some things here we got to work on. How do we go about doing that, right? What's your thoughts on that? Because the data is all well and good unless you do something with it, right? So you need to actually take that data and make actionable decisions and do something based on what you see there.
Now, you've mentioned HR professional a few times in this little part of the conversation, and we've also mentioned independent voice a few times as well. How important is it, if someone does a survey like this, that it's organized by someone either independent of the owner or outside the company?
Yeah, I think, as long as the results are anonymized, the ownership can do it, right? But it's important to make sure that's the case, and that employees feel comfortable that's the case, and not like, yeah, it's anonymous and we're actually seeing who's doing what. So having that, tool, again, HR software you may have in place already for your payroll may have that ability, which is a great way to run it through that way. Otherwise, have your HR professional kick that off, right? And kind of talk with them about what's the kind of questions we want to ask on a regular basis? What's the kind of themes we want to hit on each month that are different, and have them send out that survey, have them compile it, and then have them tell you like, okay, we saw the results. Here's what I think you should be doing based on that, right? Leverage the knowledge of the people that you hire in to help you out, right? It's the same thing on the accountant side, right? The accountant's gonna have some really great knowledge and insights that you're not necessarily going to have based on just their experience. And so leverage that experience and leverage that ability to, get that insight that you have there, because they may have some ideas or ways to address that that you may have not thought of yourself.
Now, we've already talked a little bit about hiring practices as part of big part of HR. Now, in the craft beer today, the diversity, equity, inclusion conversation is extremely important. With regard to policies in place, what do you recommend for breweries to have written down, or just, written down with regard to hiring practice to make sure they're creating an inclusive workplace? Yeah,
I think that really starts about how you go about how you hire, right? And I when you kind of start to ask that question, it really comes to, okay, well, when we have a job opening, how do we go advertise that out, right? And so if we're advertising on channels or places where we're only going to get a certain type of individual, that's not going to lead to a diverse workplace, right? So, and you don't want to just rely on like, yeah, well, I put this on, a job board and I'm just going to hope the best, right? You actually have to take those practice steps yourself as a company owner to get that diverse workforce, right? So, looking at, posting on, different areas or places where that would get in front of eyes of different people, right? It's like beer culture has a great diversity inclusion job board where you can post jobs in the beer industry that will get in front of a diverse audience that maybe your normal job posting wouldn't, right? So doing those things, I think, is important. Making sure that in your policies of how you look and hire employees, that you're not creating policies that exclude anyone or try to get people to just look like the people who are in ownership or just like the people we already have, right? Like, and I think that's a great place to start when you look at just your onboarding practice or your hiring practice is what are we doing right now that is, limiting people to come apply for us or pushing away people with diverse, backgrounds to apply for us. And how do we rectify that situation, right? And some of that maybe just look like last time we hired someone, we had all white men apply, right? Like, why was that? Is that something about our company culture that, like someone who is, LGBTQ or, someone who's female doesn't feel comfortable even applying to our business because of what we're putting out there from our culture perspective or what they even see if they come to our brewery. So kind of thinking through some of that kind of, more holistic type things, I think is important too. Because as I've talked to brewery owners, they have that question, right? And it's like, well, we put out applications, we try to get it out to a bunch of different people, but we always have the same people apply to it. Okay, well, why is that? That's not maybe it's not even an issue of you getting that job posting out to a diverse audience. It's now an issue of your company is not attractive to a diverse audiences, and how do we actually change that? And that becomes a really big, almost it's a really kind of a big undertaking just to kind of understand that, like why aren't we a business that someone who is queer would want to come work for, and how do we go about making those changes that make it more inclusive to that?
And that is such a big question. If a brewery is only getting, white male applicants, and they want to ask themselves, what can they do better? It's obviously not a checklist of 5 things they do, and they're going to magically get a diverse workforce. What are some strategies that you've seen worthwhile to a brewery in that situation? Because once again, this is not a checklist. We're just kind of mentioning things you've seen successfully, believe, might help diversify the workplace.
Yeah. So I think it starts about, what jobs are we hiring for and what qualifications are we putting around those jobs, right? So are we putting qualifications around those jobs that are only going to attract a certain type of person? Is the way our company advertises itself, it's branded, it's, the way someone comes in off the street and steps in the brewery, what did they think and feel about the brewery? Is that giving off something that is only attracting a certain audience, right? Like you see so many breweries that have, pictures of scantily clad women on their beer labels or things like that, right? Like you're going to attract a certain audience with that. And that may be an issue of why you're not bringing in a diverse audience, right? So, and some of that looks at the ownership of like, okay, are you actually trying to perpetuate having a very uninclusive environment, right? So, we've seen some of that too, where brewery owners, want to have that, like, oh, we're diverse for all that stuff, but like the owners themselves, the action they take don't show that at all, right? And so, sometimes it starts at the top and starts with, okay, like, what do you actually want here, right? And if you want that diverse audience, you need to change your behaviors and the way you run your organization. That will then allow people to feel comfortable even working at your place who are diverse.
That's a great point there, Josh. I think when any brewery is kind of just hashing out their business plan, they should be thinking about the demographic and the type of people they want to appeal to. Do they want families? Do they not want families? Are they going to be a brewery that's themed like a sports bar and wants to go after that type person? Or, God forbid, that scantily clad person on the labels that they're going after that audience? So, that's an interesting question, because just a couple days ago, we had a thread in CBP about whether or not a brewery should allow kids and families and things like that. And that's a conversation we've seen a bit over the year, the kids and families, even the dogs. What type of stance should a brewery take on something like that?
Yeah, I think, again, this gets to, okay, what are you trying to allow for your typical clientele? And are you forcing out families because you don't want that environment, right? I think And I found, as having kids and taking my kids to breweries, like I like when they allow kids in there. Like I've gone to, there's a brewery near me where they actually have a play place for kids at the brewery, right? Like, so they can go play and have fun and like, and it promotes that, that family atmosphere. But again, it looks like, okay, what does someone coming off the street when they see your brewery, what do they feel? What do they think? What are they picking up about what you want and don't want as their customer? And so when it comes to, families or kids in the breweries, the question is, okay, well, if you want that and the way your business is operating is kind of not allowing that, okay, what do we need to change for that? Or if you're against that, right, be explicit, say, okay, we don't want to have kids running around because maybe we're a small tap room and we're right next to the equipment. We don't want any injuries or things like that, or we don't want kids after a certain period of time, whatever that may be. But by making those decisions, you're also making a lot of different additional decisions by putting those stances in place. And you understand those kind of ramifications of those kind of unintentional consequences that happen, or unintentional decisions that happen by making those decisions. So, and that gets again back to diversity and inclusion and things like that. You may think that's a small little thing, like, okay, we allow kids or not allow kids, but that may answer other questions you have in your brewery about, whether, employees feel comfortable working there, what kind of culture you're trying to have in your brewery, and what that means.
Absolutely. Let's use the example. You're talking the brewery that you take your family to that allows kids, has a play place.
Yeah.
How can a brewery still keep that welcoming to everyone and also follow certain guidelines? For example, obviously you don't want kids running and screaming around and knocking people's beers over.
Right.
So how can a brewery still maintain that family-friendly, inclusive atmosphere, but also regulate it and have, standard operating procedures in place? That way they can handle any situation where it might get out of hand.
Yeah. Well, I think some of that goes to how you train your employees and staff and say, okay, like, here's the implicit rules about how how people should act, whether you're 2 years old or 50 years old, right? Like, and what we allow and don't allow, right? And so, making sure that your staff knows that, and if there's like, kids getting out of hand, like, hey, like, talk to the parents and say, like, hey, it's great that your kids are here. We love that they're here. However, like, we can't have them running around the equipment, right? Or we can't have them disturbing other people. And so that's great they're here, but can you please keep them at your table? Or we have this play place, or you can go outside and run around all you want. That's fine. But let the employees know, like, hey, we should kind of make sure we enforce rules that we have or things in place. Because one thing to say, okay, we can have kids there and they need to stay at the table or whatever, but that's not being enforced. That could cause an issue, right? So, and I think that goes for any of the rules you have, right? Like right now with a lot of breweries, you have to have a mask when you come inside, right? Like, and so having your employees say, like, if someone comes inside without a mask, like, you're right to, not allow them entry. And you don't want to say, yeah, we have a mask mandate, but then we allow people to break that, right? Because now if you're allowing people to break the rules, people don't feel comfortable. They feel like, okay, like, well, I felt like I could go there, but, I really, I've seen a lot of people not wearing their mask when they should, and now I don't feel comfortable going there anymore, right? So if you have the rules in place for those kind of procedures, how you deal with, people coming in or whatever that may be, make sure they're enforced and give the power to your staff to enforce them.
You beat me to the COVID concerns question there. But let's keep going with it. Yeah. You talk about having rules in place. We're talking about making sure the employees are made aware of the rule. But does HR extend to the customer? And how do we make sure, the guest knows, what the policy is in the tap room?
Yeah, I think there is definitely an interplay between those two things, right? When you create these policies in your tap room of how people should act, right, or what's required of customers that come in, it's important that we, one, follow through with them, two, that we communicate those to our team and make sure that we are supporting our team, that we're following through with those rules, right? So it's just another extension of how management interacts with employees. And if we have these rules in place and we're telling employees to enforce the rules, but then we are going behind them and saying, just let that person in, it's fine. What else are we doing in the background that says, okay, we have these rules in place of how you work here, but we're going to break them, or we're going to do things that are not right, and we as management are just going to allow that, and we don't want that, right? So I think when it comes to these rules and enforcing these rules in the tap room, these are things, again, should be communicated regularly to your staff, whether it's at the beginning of a shift, whether it's at a team meeting, and making sure that the company has their back, right? So like if they're going to deny someone entry and that person's like, I want to talk to the manager or whatever, that manager is going to support that employee and saying like, no, you need to have a mask here. If you're not going to have a mask, you can't come in, right? And if we're going to create these workarounds or end arounds, or we're going to break our own rules, now your employees, start to feel a lack of trust in you because they were told to do something, they did the thing they're supposed to do, and now they're in trouble for it, or they're not being listened to, or they're not feeling like they were given the authority that they should have been when you go around and do an end around them to break that rule. So I think there are definitely these interplays here of when we create these rules or create these policies in our company, that it's important that we enforce them, and if we give our team the ability to enforce them, that we support them in that endeavor.
Well, with regard to HR, the goal is obviously to try to avoid conflict in as many situations as possible. But in situations where you're dealing with an unruly customer who might have their mask off, do you recommend the HR handbook, have written policies on how to handle these interactions?
Yeah, I think there should be some written policies around it so people know like, hey, here's how we deal with that. But it also needs to be communicated and then shown when those things happen, right? So a policy is only as good as it's enforced and kept accountable. And so if we have these great policies written in place, but we don't enforce them or keep people accountable to those policies, then they're no good. And so we need to make sure that that's communicated, that employees know that this is the way the policy is of how we work, right? Same thing like, over serving a customer, right? Like know when you need to cut them off and have the authority to say like, hey, like, I'm not going to serve you the next beer because I think you're overserved at this point, and we're going to kind of cut you off there, and making sure that, again, employees know how we interact with the customers and when it's right to deny entry or when it's right to stop serving the customer for whatever reason that they're breaking the rules of the establishment, and that again that the company will make sure those are enforced and not kind of cut the legs out of the employees by allowing those things to still happen.
And at the end of the day, if a company stays true to all their, practices and beliefs, do you believe it'll just make them more successful in the long run?
It will, yeah. And I think it breeds confidence that the employees have in the company, right? As a small business, it's hard. Sometimes they bring employees in and it's hard to, make them feel like, hey, like we're a successful business and that we're going to be here for the long run and all that stuff, right? And so by putting the rules and policies in place and those kind of foundational frameworks in place and making sure that we enforce them and making sure that we're following them, it's important because that, again, that builds trust. It builds like, hey, you did what you said you were going to do, and I can trust you with these things, right? And so I think those are important things to do, and again, it all kind of feeds into that company culture of making sure, again, that the culture is something that invites your employees into it, that your employees feel comfortable there and feel supported in your business.
And Josh, so often in the hospitality industry, employees go from one job to another. They might go from a bar to a restaurant to brewery. And when they get hired at said business, the hiring manager might just assume that that person knows how to do everything. Yeah. What type of onboarding when we hire a new employee should we do, even if that employee has prior brewery experience? Should there be like, obviously that we've had the handbook, but what type of training do you recommend? And, taking it to the next step, how often should we have meetings to just reiterate and retrain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, regardless of this person's first job in the brewery or their 10th job in the brewery, right? Like we still have to follow through with our onboarding protocol, the way we train, whether that is, okay, this person's going to work with another, tap room personnel or another brewer for a period of time and kind of work underneath them. Even though they may be an expert, they may be high qualified, they don't know the rules of your establishment. They may have been taught things in the past that are totally incorrect. And so you have to establish, okay, here's the way we work. This is the way, if you're going to work for our company, you're going to follow these protocols, you're going to follow these rules. This is, the way we interact with employees or each other, the way we interact with guests, and follow through that training. Because a lot of what that training and onboarding does is really kind of set the pace and tone of what your company is to that employee. And so if we ignore it or we say, okay, well, you're an expert, just go and do stuff, right? They may have habits or ways they've worked in the past that don't work in the way we work in our company. And so we want to make sure that we build those things up. And again, we should train on that stuff on a regular basis. Just because we train on it once when they first started does not mean that's the only time training happens. Training and the way we build up our employees is a continual improvement type process. So that's why it's important to have regular kind of staff check-ins and meetings and things where we train on different things, or hey, we got a new side pull tap. This is how we're going to do it, and this is how we want this to be presented to the customer, and how we do it here, right? And so we want to make sure we continuously train there and make sure they understand, because as employees work at a place, they get more comfortable, and maybe they start to take shortcuts or liberties, and we don't want that. And so we want to make sure people are following our process procedures, our rules of how we work, and ensure that everyone's on the same page there.
Is there a recommended frequency you suggest having, staff trainings or staff meetings, even if it's just check in with one another?
Yeah, I think, generally maybe at the beginning of a shift. So maybe it's when we open up for the day, or we have a shift change, that we have a kind of initial meeting with that group of people coming on and saying, okay, here's what's going on. Hey, we put this new beer on tap, and here's what it is. Let's taste it so you understand what it is, so you can explain it to the customers. Or, hey, we put this new thing in place. I want to make sure you understand it. So having those kind of regular, just, quick stand-up check-ins with your team as they start the shift for the day, I think is important. Having a kind of regular formal staff meeting monthly is important as well. And this can be something that I think actually works really well virtually. So you're not having people who are not working that day have to come in for this meeting, but they can, be at home, take the meeting, and do it from there. And I think those are great ways to then get everyone on the same page, because you're all there together. Kind of talk through maybe changes that are happening, talk through, okay, hey, we got someone new starting here on Monday. Let's make sure they feel welcomed. And this person's going to kind of help train them up. And, or there's this new, sexual harassment training we have to do. We're all going to do it together on this next team meeting, right? And so, having those regular team meetings is important. Even if you have a staff of 3 or 4 different people, I think it's still important to build that habit in. So when you do grow your business, and now you have a staff of 10 or 12, you're not trying to now recreate the wheel at this point when you've now grown it in that size. So build out these foundational elements from the get-go really helps you as you grow your business as well. And having those kind of monthly staff meetings is, I think, really important.
And craft beer is so much about storytelling, and HR policies are part of your company's story. Whether they might be a little more boring than some of the more beer-related functions, they are an important part of your brand's image. That's going to go from the ownership to your staff to your guests. Yeah. And going back to sexual harassment as we wind down, what do you say to a brewery that claims we don't have an issue with sexual harassment here? Should a brewery like that, whether or not they do or don't, should they do some sort of sexual harassment training just to educate themselves? Or, what are the recommendations for just preparing for a bad situation? Yeah,
I think, you can have that brewer who says, oh yeah, we don't have any issues. And maybe you have some, rose-colored glasses in that situation, or maybe you're just not seeing it, right? Like, you should never make that assumption we don't have any issues, because you may have it and just not seeing it right now. So it's important to have, doing sexual harassment training, and, letting your employees know, hey, if you are being harassed in any way, let, a HR professional know, let someone on staff know that's not that person, that this is happening, so it can be dealt with, because we don't want this to become a systemic thing in our company. So having that regular training there, I think is important. Now, a lot of states are starting to require that sexual harassment training, but even if your state doesn't require it, I think it's still a good practice to do it, and talk through, okay, what does this mean? What's, kind of what is sexual harassment? What does it look like? Give examples, because it can be something, I think everyone has a big serious thing in their head, but it could be something really, almost innocent, but it's still sexual harassment. And so you should make sure people are aware of that, and what the kind of warning signs to see, or what things you should do once you start to see this or experience this, because we want that to be taken care of immediately and not left to kind of fester in the organization. So I think those are regular things that should be addressed with your team, that you discuss about, and have open, frank conversations about it. Don't just, read off, here's the required things I need to tell you. Okay, great, we're done. Because if you don't treat it with the seriousness that it needs, no one else is going to treat it with the seriousness that it needs. So make sure when you do talk about, be frank about it, have those discussions, talk about, okay, what's going on, and what, if anyone does feel uncomfortable, like, it is really important that you bring it up and say something, because if you don't, this could become an issue that that spreads throughout that we don't want to have. So I think being frank and earnest and giving it the points that it deserves is key, and not just trying to check the box on it.
Exactly. You don't want to check the box. You want to get the staff buy-in. You want the staff to want to be better. I mean, you got to build that positive company culture because it's going to radiate to everyone. I want to touch one more time on motivation. What are some of the best strategies to come back to that you've seen breweries be able to motivate their teams to want to get behind that sexual harassment program, to want to become more inclusive, to just want to be better in the workplace, whether it's, a gift card to a local restaurant or you take a team bowling. What are some of the best strategies you've seen to get people motivated?
Yeah, I think incentivizing it is good. So put in, gift cards, bonuses, whatever to incentivize this is important. I think, again, putting money where your mouth is always a great way to get that buy-in. But I think it's also creating that culture where employees feel like they have investment and buy-in and that their opinion matters in what's going on. So ways we can elevate that, right? So maybe you have an employee that has an idea of making the company better, that you follow through on it. You give them that kind of like, yeah, I think let's try this out. Let's see if it works. Because now you're kind of giving that employee the buy-in and investment. And it feels less like, this kind of hierarchical organization, but this kind of cohesive team that's working together. And so motivated, putting those kind of incentives and motivating around that, I think is good. Because, someone who's just, hey, I'm, serving beer 3 times a week, but I have some ideas that can benefit this organization, you can bring those up. It works. Give them a financial incentive by bringing it up and saying, hey, like, if you have any ideas to make this company better and we can follow through and it works, we will give you a bonus because we really think that's important. And so by giving that kind of authority into your team, I think it really creates a great environment and allows that buying to happen when you do talk about sexual harassment or talk about some of these that are weightier, heavier things that are important to the business. They'll be felt buy-in because they kind of trust what's going on in this company.
Absolutely. Everybody's voice matters, whether it's the 1 day a week beer tender or it's the person who's there, 80 hours a week doing whatever they're doing. I think that's the lesson we need to accept, that you need to know everyone at your company, need to know what they want, need to know who they are, what they stand for, and you need to be in it together as a team.
Exactly.
So it's unfortunate that we've seen, circumstances in craft beer that we don't want to read about in the news recently, but hopefully it does draw attention to the fact that it is an issue we need to confront and we need to be better about it. So Josh, I really appreciate you taking the time as always today to share your expertise. It's always a good time to hang out with you. I hope you have a beautiful day in Chicago, and hopefully we're sharing beers before too long. So
awesome.
Appreciate it once more. See you later.
Yeah.
Bye.